Welcome back, everybody, to our final lesson looking at the philosophy of John Rawls. This has been a series of about 7 or 8 lessons that have essentially taken an overview to the basic philosophies and basic ideas that are enshrined in the writings of John Rawls, the political philosophies of John Rawls. This lesson is going to finish by talking about global justice, talking about the internationalization of a theory of justice, the ways in which Rawls was, at least initially, particularly, let's just say, reticent about the idea of global justice, and still is in his writings to this day. And so, as a result of which, we can get some better ideas of how his writings fit into the broader global justice literature that is very, very vast and has almost expanded on an exponential basis over the last 20 or 30 years. Arguably, the most important contributions to political philosophy in the last 40 or so years has been this idea of taking a theory of justice, taking theories of political philosophy, and internationalizing them, going beyond what is just the domestic framework and talking about how this applies internationally and globally. The concept of global justice has grown in prevalence almost in conjunction with the growth in globalization towards the end of the Cold War and as we enter into the 21st century. The most important and pertinent writing that John Rawls actually establishes when he talks about a theory of justice on an international level is his theories in a law of peoples. So we'll get to the law of peoples in a second and talk about how he understands global justice in that framework then. But for now, let's just think about global justice more generally, okay? Because for the longest of time, philosophers essentially took political philosophy to be something of a domestic framework, to be something that is limited to a domestic setting. Philosophers also take justice to be something of a domestically orientated idea. The idea that justice is achieved within the confines of a state, and then the relationship between other states does not have ascribed to it any kind of concept of justice. You then see the sort of growth in global justice theories with the writings of people like Charles Beats and people like Thomas Pogge, who essentially starts to develop theories of justice towards the middle part of the 20th century, towards the end of the 20th century, and then developing into the 21st century. Now, some of the earliest assumptions that Rawls contributes to the ways in which theory of justice applies beyond that of a basic society is that he believed that society was, quote, a closed system, isolated from other societies. Okay, this is written very early on in a theory of justice. What does this tell us, at least initially in his earliest writings? Well, it tells us that he did not put much stock into the idea of global justice and to the idea of internationalizing justice beyond that of the state itself, the closed society. In political liberalism, Rawls argues that, quote, all citizens are fully cooperating members of a society over a complete life. Again, talking about a confined space, a confined system, that being the society, the isolated society from which people live and they develop theories of justice within that society, not global society, not societies that cross borders. Now, in fairness to Rawls, globalization has happened a lot since his death in the early 2000s, and so as a result of this, of course, he might have a completely different conception of justice on a global level to what he did when he wrote Law of Peoples in the 1990s. But even when he was writing A Theory of Justice and Political Liberalism in the 70s and 80s, I believe, you obviously have some kind of interconnectedness within societies at this time. And there was not isolationism in the world in the 70s and the 80s. So the idea of having a global theory of global justice which is isolated from other societies is one that, at least in my conception and in my thoughts process in my own head, is something of a strange idea, a strange conception. This assumption of society being some kind of closed system would have to be relaxed when it comes to the development of global justice and the idea that global justice is not going away. So writers like Thomas Pogge and writers like Charles Beats, who wrote Charles Beats was writing in, I believe, the 1980s, and then Thomas Pogge comes in the 1990s, early 2000s, theories of global justice were not going away, okay? And so as a result of this, John Rawls had to come up with some kind of his own theory of justice that can cross borders. Theories of justice will have to reconcile with the fact that a just society may no longer simply be limited to the confines of a particular state, and instead will cross borders. One of the reasons for this, and one of the arguments for this, at least some of the arguments that I presented when I was writing parts of my PhD thesis, was the idea that essentially, how can we talk about justice as being closed off within a closed society, within a domestic framework, when the impact of that state may have long-reaching effects onto other states? So, for example, I was writing in the context of international investment law. How can we say that we will only ever talk about justice domestically, and we'll only talk about theories of justice within the domestic framework, when states in investment law influence quite significantly other countries, okay, and peoples in other countries? The United States has and the companies of the United States have significant impact over abroad, in places like Argentina, in Latin America, in Africa, and in Asia. So how does it make sense to suggest that the obligations to those individuals across borders doesn't exist in the same way that it does to individuals within that border? When in some cases, native people living in Argentina and Africa may have be greater impacted by the investors of the United States than people who live in the United States are. And so the result of this is that we should really, because of the interconnectedness of the planet, show that the justice should also be interconnected as well. It also makes sense to suggest that global justice is important because some of the most prominent injustices in the world, okay, are those that cannot be solved by simply reference to domestic institutions. We can't, for example, solve climate change within our own countries. That has to be internationally agreed upon standards. There has to be international consensus and cooperation and agreement between every single country on Earth, essentially, about how to tackle climate change, and every single country have to implement climate change standards. You can't just suggest that, the United Kingdom is implementing environmental policies, therefore the climate change, at least in the United Kingdom, is fine, and then the rest of the world can do what it wants. Climate change is a global issue. It does not represent borders, okay? It does not care if there is a border between two countries. Climate change will just affect everyone, not necessarily equally, but it will affect everybody in adverse ways. The same can be said and argued for one of the things that happened very, very recently, the idea of pandemics. A pandemic doesn't care or respect borders, and so as a result of that, pandemic retaliation-based policies should also probably be international in character, given the fact that if this isn't the case, then pandemics will continue to happen and will continue to adversely impact every single state on Earth, like, for example, the coronavirus pandemic in 2020 to sort of 2022. So all of this can be said to suggest that global justice is very, very important, and that you can't just hand-wave away the idea of global justice by saying that justice can only be reconciled out of a domestic system. And Rawls had to think about this himself. And so as a result of this, Rawls would have to do the same and look at how a just liberal society operates on the international plane. So some global justice scholars will make the prescriptions whatever principles of justice ought to be applied to a society should then just be internationalized and to create a system of global justice. So some argue that essentially, if you've developed and you have a good system of of domestic justice and what you believe to be a good just settlement for political philosophy within the confines of a state, all you have to do is just internationalize it. All you have to do is just expand that beyond the state and suggest that it should apply to the whole planet. Which is a very simple and, in my opinion, a quite lazy way of trying to understand global justice. And Rawls doesn't do this. Rawls takes a different position. He actually develops a completely different theory of justice to try and apply to the global setting, okay? He takes the view that a, quote, second original position ought to be established in order to formulate very good liberal foreign policy. And this is really where we get back to a law of peoples, okay? Now, he argues that the second original position, this new original position that should be applied to global justice, okay, should instill two basic principles. It should instill something known as a difference principle and something known as the fair equality of opportunity principle. The basic charter for the law of peoples is outlined in a series of following ideas about the application of these principles to the situations of global justice themselves. And this is really where we see the bedrock, the core of Rawls's theory of global justice. He argues in these particular principles. He argues that peoples are free and independent, and their freedom and independence are to be respected by other peoples. This essentially tells us that subjugating, enslaving, disrespecting the independence and freedom of peoples is, of course, not a good idea, and is an unjust system of global justice. If that happens, then you are being unjust in doing so. People are to observe treaties and undertakings, essentially an observation of international law. He understands, and like a lot of global justice scholars, understands international law to be quite a significant framework for the operationalization of global justice, essentially, or it could at least potentially be a good framework for doing so. They don't necessarily all argue that international law is perfect, but that it can be a particularly useful method by which justice can be ascribed and created. Peoples are equal and are parties to the agreements that bind them. Peoples are to observe a duty of non-intervention. So non-intervention into some of the basic conceptions of situations, for example, crisis situations that take place around the world. Peoples have a right to self-defense, but not a right to instigate war for reasons other than self-defense. This takes a little bit of a shot at the United Nations Charter, given that self-defense isn't the only justification, legal justification for the use of force. In fact, Security Council resolution could also represent a legal use of force. But self-defense is obviously a very important element of the international law on the use of force. Peoples are to observe certain specified restrictions in the conduct of war. This is essentially a theory of a liberal theory of global justice will respect the basic principles of international humanitarian law, the laws of war. Okay, there are specific restrictions when it comes to the conduct of war. You can't just do anything in warfare, and this is an idea that, even though it was enshrined in the sort of mid to late 1800s with the development of the earliest Geneva Conventions, it is something that is generally seen to be a respected principle for quite a lot of human history, even if it wasn't necessarily followed and respected. The idea of fairness in warfare has been an idea that has been sort of formulated across thousands of years. In fact, there were examples of the English during the 100 Years' War believing that things like the crossbow were not fair, and so they refused to use them. This idea of chivalry in warfare, the idea of not reducing to barbarism as being an element of war. Now, whether or not people actually respected and adhered to those principles is a different question, but whether or not they thought about them is something that does actually seem to be the case when we talk about the history of warfare. But at least in terms of the late 1800s onwards, there have been actual codified laws of war that people have to follow for fear of repercussions for committing war crimes. Part 7 says that people have a duty to assist other peoples in living who are living in unfavourable conditions that prevent their having a just or decent political or social regime, i.e. there should be some kind of support mechanism in place for those who live in places which are below that of a basic human standard. This is all formulated, by the way, in page 37 of A Law of Peoples, and it gives us a general idea of where Rawls sits his idea of a theory of global justice. Now, Rawls's intentions here are to provide a framework for understanding the application of principles of justice to an international community, while also recognizing that there is a certain amount of complexity that can exist in the ways in which both liberal and decent peoples may organize their social structures. Now, this is one of the things that's quite interesting about A Law of Peoples, is that Rawls himself doesn't really talk about this in the context of states and a discussion of states. He talks about it in the context of peoples, and he spends quite a lot of time, in fact, at the start of Law of Peoples, discussing the concept between liberal peoples, decent peoples, and then barbarous regimes. And he talks and he gives examples, he gives thought experiments, and theoretical thought experiments as well, of theoretical groups of peoples. But one of the things that's interesting here is he's not talking about states, he's talking about peoples, he's talking about communities. So what he describes with his theory of a law of peoples is what he conceptualizes as a, quote, realistic utopia. So he's talking about trying to develop a theory of global justice that is as utopic as possible, but on a realistic basis, on the understanding that they're trying to be realistic in doing so, and not trying to formulate a utopia that is unrealistic and impossible to ever achieve. Okay, now finally, I just want to go and talk very briefly about some of the critiques of this theory. Some of the most ardent critiques of Rawls in this regard come from what are known as cosmopolitan principles of global justice. Okay, so for example, it appears that Rawls understands global relations and the idea of international politics as one in which he conceptualizes states or peoples as being independent. Ultimately, Rawls will fail to recognize the extent to which states are increasingly interconnected and that are influenced by dominant power structures within the international political system. The logical consequence of this failure, of this omission on Rawls' part, is that he fails to observe the extent to which poor socioeconomic conditions are perpetuated by factors which are external to the state itself. Okay? Simply put, there exists within international politics, within international law, within global justice, the idea of hegemony, the idea of hegemonic principles in which larger, more powerful states have an influence over the smaller, less powerful states. And the interconnectedness can also shift and sway the ways in which the smaller states are able to be influenced by the larger states. So states with poor socioeconomic conditions, maybe, if we're going to talk about in my theories as applied to my thesis, if we're going to talk about concepts of more powerful economic states being more likely to instigate foreign direct investment into poorer states, the poorer states are then going to essentially adjust their political systems and adjust their policies to try and make themselves more amenable to the idea of getting investment from these richer states. So you can see just in that one example the ways in which poorer states with poorer socioeconomic conditions can be influenced by the larger states with more investment ability for them. And so the idea of global hegemony is also very, very important. The extent to which the United States, for example, influences quite a lot of international law and international politics is one that is heavily critiqued among many critical international lawyers, many people who are of a more third world perspective of international law, all of these different things as well. So this is a critique of Rawlsian theory of global justice because it sort of assumes something that doesn't really seem to exist in reality, despite the fact that so too does international law. It assumes the equality of states, but again, the sort of reality versus the idea or the dream is something that is clearly different. Now, I hope you've enjoyed this series of lessons covering the theories of John Rawls, giving a basic overview and an introduction to the political philosophy of John Rawls. The next of our Great Minds in Philosophy series is, and has been voted on by you already, to be the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. So we're going to do about 10 or so lessons talking about Immanuel Kant's philosophy, both his epistemology, his metaphysics, his political philosophy, and his moral philosophy, all of which we'll talk about in future lessons' time. And then we'll do another vote for another set of philosophers for you to look at and to see what other great minds in philosophy you want me to cover next.